everybody. Seattle saw an estimated turnout of 100,000 people Saturday for the second annual Women's March. Activism is nothing new to this area, and an article in the latest issue of Seattle Met highlights our special history. Joining me now are the article's authors, Madeline Ostrander and Valerie Schloredt. It's good to have you guys. What inspired you to write the article at this time?
Well, as you said, I mean, there's been an immense and renewed interest in activism.
This last year's been interesting, hasn't it?
Right, and so, you know, we wanted to highlight the fact that there's a long tradition of activism in Seattle, and that tradition goes back more than a century.
Exactly, and some very interesting things that you call attention to. Let's talk first about the 1919 general strike, and we have some photos to show, but tell me the significance.
Well, this made Seattle really famous around the world for labor activism.
Was this the wobbly situation?
There were wobblies, and about 100 unions operating in Seattle came out in support of the shipbuilders when they didn't get the pay rise that they'd been promised after the First World War. 65,000 workers went out on strike. A very peaceful 6 days that shut down the city and made Seattle famous across the world for its labor movement.
Very interesting. 1930s, Hooverville.
Yes, Hooverville was actually an example of self-reliance and community organizing. There were about 1,000 inhabitants, and about 7,000 passed through Hooverville over the years of the Depression. They had representatives who negotiated with the city for permission to stay and for the rules that governed the community. And at the same time, people all over Seattle were organizing to pool their labor so that they could feed themselves.
And people came from other areas to pass through Hooverville, or this was largely people who were already in the Northwest? There
was a tradition of people, sort of transient labor, but those jobs for those people dried up during the Depression. So they were usually always trying to get work, and they were always being moved on.
Going from place to place.
That's where Hooverville came in. It gave them a place to stay.
Wow. In the 1970s, the Native American fishing rights.
Yeah, so starting in the 60s, really, a group of young Native American activists, and here we have a picture of Marlon Brando with a Puget Sound tribal leader. So he came up to fish with the Native American activists. They were protesting the fact that the state of Washington was failing to honor Native treaty rights that had been treaties that had been signed a century before that gave Native people the right to fish all over the waters of Puget Sound. Instead, Native people were being arrested for fishing. And so these activists held what they called fish-ins, and they fished as a way of protest, and eventually that led to a court decision that re-acknowledged those rights and has had lasting implications for Puget Sound.
They've had them ever since.
Right.
Okay, 1999, boy do I remember this, the Wto protest. We used a different last initial while we were covering it because it was pretty crazy out on the streets. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, so I thought this was especially fascinating because it's an example to me of how Seattle's influenced in a national discussion, because really this protest brought to light a lot of people's concerns about global trade deals. So the city of Seattle hosted a meeting of the World Trade Organization, and a huge number of activists got together and decided they were going to try to actually stop the meeting physically by putting their bodies in the streets.
Keeping the representatives from getting to the meetings.
Right. And so it was a very confrontational protest. It was a little controversial in some ways, but I think that it also importantly raised the issue of international trade and global trade, and you see that issue being discussed both on the left and the right now. You saw it in the Trump campaign, and you still see Trump talking about trade.
It is a current
and
issue.
Bernie Sanders, and all over the left, also concerns about global trade deals.
And more than likely, that'll be one of the topics that President Trump talks about in Davos. So, I mean, this was the first time I remember one of my friends in New York called and said, they're protesting about blue cheese, what's happening? It's a little more complicated than that, but since then we definitely have a lot of people concerned about that. And then in 2015, the kayaktivism.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite
combining
examples.
Sports and activism. That's so Seattle.
I thought that this was a really beautiful protest.
It was.
It was very colorful. Hundreds of environmental activists went out on the waters of Puget Sound, and they paddled up in front of this giant drilling rig that had sailed into Seattle It was a drilling rig owned by the company Royal Dutch Shell, and it was heading up to the Arctic to drill offshore in Alaska. And again, to me, this is an example of how Seattle helped raise this issue to a level of a national conversation. And then, of course, in November of that year, Obama actually canceled offshore drilling leases. And of
here
course,
we are with them
here we
coming
are.
back now.
Yeah, they're coming back again. But so, you know, those debates keep coming.
Continue. But it does point out the fact that this kind of activism, protesting, organizing, all of these things are in our civic lifeblood.
Yeah.
And that we're often a bit ahead of our time in identifying what the issues are.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Seattle and Seattle activists have a tradition of really being very forward-thinking and bringing to light issues that then become later part of a national conversation. And I think, you know, Seattle has a long tradition of very engaged citizenry, and of course activism, to me, is just part of our democratic process.
Part of being a citizen, we
being
hope.
hard and expressing ourselves.
Well, thank you very much. I hope everybody will pick up a copy of the magazine or go online and read it, because it's really very interesting stuff. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And we have the Amazon Go store, so we're just knocking it out of the park in all directions. Up next, learn about a unique tribute for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Amazing stuff here in Seattle after this.